Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to play historical detectives today. I mean, we've all heard of Atlantis, right? The legendary sunken city, glowing crystals, advanced technology, the whole shebang. But what if the history of Europe was actually rewritten by a 19th century hoaxer with a brilliant imagination? Today, we are reconstructing the fractured timeline of things like the infamous Oera Linda Book, weighing its claims of a submerged civilization against harsh scientific reality. From the allure of a Nordic Atlantis to the absolute sting of archaeological betrayal, this is an investigation into a manuscript that honestly should not exist.
So, how on earth did a philosophical Greek allegory warp into the ultimate geographical conspiracy? We are going to strip away centuries of pop culture today to see how a simple moral lesson turned into a literal global hunt spanning from the ice of Antarctica to the Baltic Sea. To answer that, we have to start with the actual evidence.
Section 1, The Blueprint, grounding the investigation in Plato's original text.
Let's start with the only primary source that actually matters here, the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato, way back in 360 BC. Everything we know about Atlantis comes from just two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. And what's really fascinating here is that Plato introduces Atlantis not as some peaceful, enlightened utopia, but as an aggressive, insolent empire. He described this massive imperialistic naval power located beyond the Pillars of Hercules that had literally enslaved parts of Europe and North Africa and was just bearing down on the free world. And this brilliantly illustrates Plato's actual intent. He was creating a fictional literary contrast. On one side, you have his idealized version of ancient Athens, which represents the perfect society he described in his earlier work, The Republic. On the other side, Atlantis is its dark mirror, a wealthy, technologically advanced, but totally morally bankrupt society. It's a classic setup for a philosophical smackdown.
Which brings us to hubris. The crucial point to remember is that Atlantis sinking into the mud was meant to be a moral lesson about the absolute dangers of excessive pride and hubris. It was definitely not a historical weather report. The Atlanteans lose their divine favor, they get defeated by the underdog Athenians, and then the gods punish them with earthquakes and floods, wiping them out in a single day and night. For ancient scholars, like Plato's own student Aristotle, it was super obvious this was just an invented myth designed to teach a lesson. Moving on to Section 2. The Hijacking, how 19th century literalists stripped the allegory of its philosophy.
So, if it was just a metaphor, how did it become literal history? Look at this timeline. We've got a massive chronological gap. For centuries, folks like Francis Bacon used Atlantis just as a utopian literary device, but then the 19th century hits. This is an era where brilliant hoaxers began rewriting history. We see the emergence of bizarre manuscripts like the notorious Oera Linda Book, which claimed a submerged Frisian civilization, kind of like a Nordic Atlantis, actually existed. Suddenly, literal interpretations like Ignatius Donnelly's 1882 book totally changed the game.
Ignatius Donnelly is basically the father of the 19th century Atlantis revival. He took Plato's story entirely literally. He published a book arguing that Atlantis was the physical origin of all human civilizations, the birthplace of language, and get this, even the biblical Garden of Eden. It's kind of wild to think about how he made the massive leap from a Greek philosopher's textbook to Mayan ruins and biblical floods, popularizing the whole idea that myths contain hidden literal truths just waiting to be decoded. But taking an objective look at the data, this historical game of telephone eventually took a really dark turn. Occultists like Madame Blavatsky tied Atlantis to the esoteric origins of human root races. By reshaping a philosophical myth into a story of racial origins, these writers inadvertently laid down a mythological precedent that was later heavily adopted by extreme political movements, including Nazi ideologies to justify their supremacist platforms.
Which leads us to Section 3, the search, mapping the unmappable across the globe. Once the public believed Atlantis was a real physical place, a frantic global search kicked off. Explorers threw Plato's philosophical intentions right out the window, the search fractured everywhere. Building off those 19th century Nordic hoaxes we talked about, some theorists pointed to the Sea of Azov or the Baltic Sea. You had an eccentric thinker named Igor Bach claiming Atlantis was actually in Finland. Others pointed to Mesoamerica, or even dragged Earth's shifting crust theories into the mix to place it under Antarctica. Just imagine Plato's reaction to us searching for his philosophical metaphor under a mile of Antarctic ice. Absolute geographical chaos.
But looking at this massive list, you really have to ask yourself, Are all these people just seeing exactly what they want to see, or is there actually a shred of truth hidden in the geography? Why do so many totally separate locations feature stories of catastrophic flooding and sunken rands that echo Plato's text?
Let's look at Section 4, Testing the Legend, applying modern archaeological methodology to the text.
This brings us to a super fascinating modern approach, applying strict, rigorous scientific methodology to Plato's ancient words. Instead of just picking a random spot on the map and trying to force the myth to fit, researchers are reversing the process. They isolate every single environmental, hydrological, and geographical detail Plato provided: the vast plains, the specific dimensions, the catastrophic disappearance. Each detail becomes a strict scientific pass-fail test. And thanks to modern seabed mapping, we can actually look at the real prehistoric world to see what passes.
And what's truly mind-blowing is that regions like Doggerland in the North Sea provide a stunningly real example of a submerged world. This isn't a fringe theory, it's a cold, hard geological fact. Thousands of years ago, right before sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, a massive land bridge connected Great Britain to mainland Europe. Now sure, there were no glowing crystals down there, but this real sunken landscape satisfies a shocking amount of Plato's environmental descriptions. We're talking vast plains matching his dimensions, interconnected waterways, abundant wildlife, and a completely tragic, dramatic disappearance due to post-glacial sea level rise. It really forces us to ask if Plato's allegory, and maybe even the inspiration for those 19th century Northern European hoaxes, was actually built on top of a very real, deep ancestral memory of lands lost to the ocean millennia before he was even born. Now for Section 5, the modern fallout, the sociological impact of pseudo-archaeology today. So, we've got real, rigorous science on one side, but on the other, the myth continues to be hijacked on modern social media. To understand this modern fallout, we first need to clearly define pseudo-archaeology. These are alternative claims about history that completely reject scientific methodology. They usually rely on circumstantial evidence, taking a tiny piece of a myth here, a random geological anomaly there, and stitching them all together into a rigid alternative timeline. A recent semantic analysis of social media shows exactly how these modern conspiracies operate. Algorithms actively amplify these claims by tapping into anti-institutional sentiment, basically the idea that elite academics are hiding the truth from us. Neutrally reporting on the data here, it reveals that these insular networks often engage in historical revisionism, which has a documented, very real pattern of cross-pollinating with supremacist rhetoric. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why all of this matters. The romantic allure of a lost super-civilization actively harms our understanding of real, incredible ancient cultures. Sincere archaeology tests hypotheses, adapts to new evidence, and respects the ingenuity of indigenous peoples. Pseudo-archaeology, on the other hand, starts with a wild conclusion, like, say, Atlanteans building the pyramids, and simply ignores any contradictory evidence. Ultimately, it strips indigenous populations around the world of their very real historical achievements. Section 6. Conclusion. The enduring power of a good story. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to marvel at the 2,000-year journey of Plato's fictional island. We find ourselves straddling the line between a philosopher's imagination and the faint, ancestral memory of real flooded landscapes at the end of the Ice Age. The science proves that the catastrophic flooding described in the myth absolutely happened to places like Doggerland. The geological trauma is incredibly real, even if the brass walls and Poseidon's temples were just literary inventions. So, it leaves you wondering if the harsh scientific reality of our planet's past is already filled with dramatic, sunken landscapes. Why do we still prefer the myth? What is it about human nature that makes us desperately want to believe the impossible, even when the incredible reality is sitting right there, just beneath the waves? That, I think, is a mystery truly worth exploring.